We've got big sandals to fill. Isn't it just like Jesus to not only wash the feet of his friends, but to also wash the feet of the men he knows will betray and deny him? And think about it. Just touching someone's feet is a bit personal and possibly unpleasant. But it's more than that, isn't it? Foot washing in ancient times was a menial task. It involved washing off not just dust and mud, but also animal waste and even the remains of human excrement which had been poured out into the streets. This act of hospitality was normally assigned to slaves or servants of low status, particularly females, so much so that foot washing was virtually synonymous with slavery. There is no other account in all of ancient literature where a person of superior status voluntarily washes the feet of someone of inferior status. Of course, this is not just an honored teacher who is performing a shameful act, but a divine figure with sovereignty over the entire cosmos who has taken on the role of slave. If I had to choose one word other than love for Jesus, I think it might just be humble. The bookends of Jesus' life are drenched in humility. Jesus left his position with God and humbled himself in the form of a baby. His human life ended with shameful humility on a cross, and Jesus literally loses himself in love. And now he models humble service in a tangible way for his disciples to understand and hopefully to imitate. Remember, his disciples were no different than the rest of us, always jockeying for position, to be seen, to be great, to sit first chair. Humility does not come naturally or easily for most of us, which is why I found the story of Michael Caine's humble beginnings so heartwarming. As you know, Sir Michael Caine is an English actor, producer, and author. He has appeared in more than 130 films during a career that spans over 60 years. As a struggling unknown, Michael Caine once came to the last resort of starving actors, a casting agency run by a man named Ronnie Curtis. This is how Caine tells it. Ronnie was very cross-eyed, so when he came out, pointed at us and said, "You," the three of us stood up. This didn't seem to throw him at all. I suppose he was used to it. Then he asked, "What size is your chest?" Well, each of us still thought he was addressing us alone, so we answered in unison with our chest measurements. When he asked, "Who said 40?" I put my hand up, and he said, "What's your inside leg measurement?" 32. His eyes lit up. "Perfect. Come on," he said, calling me into his small office. When I got inside, he explained that I would be playing the role of a police officer the next day in a small film. I had been cast because I fit the uniform that the company already had in their wardrobe. Many of us have been on that path of striving and working so hard to earn our promotions and our positions that we find it hard to not take all of the credit ourselves. And I was wondering, how do we learn to pick up the towel the way Jesus did? How do we live into John 3:30, which says, "He must increase, but I must decrease, more of him, less of me"? Humility is one of those virtues that is never gained by seeking it. The more we pursue it, the more distant it becomes. But here's the good news. Of all the spiritual disciplines, service is the most conducive to the growth of humility. When we set out on a consciously chosen course of action that works for the good of others and is, for the most part, a hidden work, a deep change occurs in our spirits. I love how Richard Foster put it, the flesh whines against service, but it screams against hidden service. It strains and pulls for honor and recognition. It will devise subtle, religiously acceptable means to call attention to the service rendered. If we strongly refuse to give in to this lust of the flesh, we crucify it. Every time we crucify the flesh, we crucify our pride and arrogance. In the 18th century, William Law wrote that every day should be viewed as a day of humility. And we do this by learning how to serve others. If we want humility, here is what he recommends. To condescend to all the weaknesses and infirmities of your fellow creatures, cover their frailties, love their excellencies, encourage their virtues, relieve their wants, rejoice in their prosperities, compassionate their distress, receive their friendship, overlook their unkindness, forgive their malice, be a servant of servants, and condescend to do the lowest offices to the lowest of mankind. Lord, have mercy. I cannot do that. And I suppose maybe that's the point. Apart from me, you can do nothing. As we explore this service discipline, I think it's important to distinguish between servant and service. When we choose to serve, we decide to whom and when we will serve. But when we choose to be a servant, we give up that right to be in charge. Take, for example, Wesley from the movie The Princess Bride. He was the farm boy who was in love with Princess Buttercup. His response to her every request was, "As you wish." And he went to great lengths with amazing adventures, often risking his life to serve her. But to choose to be a servant means we are open and vulnerable to a higher calling. Our whole life becomes an act of service for others. In the Message Bible, Eugene Peterson says in Romans 12:1, so here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. The voluntary servanthood is to God, which means being available to whomever and whatever God brings our way, which is very different than serving the prince or princess of our dreams. One wise person I know said that his morning prayer is simply this: show me who to love today, O God. In the book Life Together, pastor, theologian, and anti-Nazi dissident Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote, we must be ready to allow ourselves to be interrupted by God, and that nobody is too good for the meanest service. This makes me think about the importance of creating some margin in my life so that I have the privilege of responding to such an interruption. When we respond to God's interruption with an act of service, I believe that our attitude is very important. Being ministered to by a grumpy person or somebody who thinks that she's above all this or that she's being greatly inconvenienced is often worse than no help at all. Think of Cinderella. She had the attitude of what we call a servant's heart. Despite her predicament, she was always singing while scrubbing and making friends with little critters. She followed the instruction of her late mother when she said, in order to thrive, you must have courage and be kind. And Cinderella did this, which is good, but she didn't have a choice. Well, she had a choice for her attitude, but she didn't have a choice for her servanthood. She was held captive in a dysfunctional family, locked away in a castle without options as a penniless female with no education in a patriarchal kingdom. For us, in the 21st century, we have a choice. And Jesus is inviting us to choose a life of servanthood, because that's where the blessing is. But we are only fooling ourselves if we don't believe attitude is a critical part of this process. If we are going to pick up our towels with the right spirit, we must pay attention to two words: gratitude and compassion. Gratitude basically means to receive the gifts of God and others. We prefer to be on the giving side, the side of position and power, with the illusion that we have it all together. But we often forget that the greater joy is in giving people the space and opportunity to give back to us. For us to see the divine presence in the other person to whom we thought we were serving is to welcome the presence of God who was already there. Through you and your giving, I receive the gift of love, and I see the face of God. And for that, I am grateful. The other necessary word for any act of service is compassion. Do you remember that old story about the guy who had dreamt that he had died, and he opened up a door that had above it, "For the damned"? Inside, once he opened it, he saw an enormous table filled with all of the best food and drink, and around that table was a number of people, all tethered to their chairs with an arm tied behind their back, and tethered to their free hand was a spoon with a handle too long that it made it impossible for them to feed themselves from their plate. Although food fit for a king lay just within inches of them, those poor wretches were obviously suffering from the final stages of starvation. The man quickly backed out of that room, and then he noticed another door, and above that door it read, "For the saved." And he opened that door, and he saw the same table laden with all of the most delicious food and drink, and similarly, people around that table tied to their chairs with their arm behind their back, and this one long spoon that does them no good. But there was a great difference. Instead of starving miserably, the people in the second room were happy and well fed. Though their spoons were too long to use to feed themselves, they had realized that they were not too long to feed their neighbors. What I love about this story is how compassion can bring such joy and blessing to life. In this case, compassion literally gives life. Given the atmosphere in the room, it was clear that those who chose to feed their neighbors weren't doing it in a calculated or a selfish way. They didn't have the attitude, well, if I feed him, then he'll feed me. But instead, their service was done out of love. They lost themselves in love. Those who are willing to serve and care about their neighbors can feast on a life filled with compassion and understanding, both given and received. Jesus was often moved by compassion, which means to suffer with. Jesus felt a love so deep for the people in front of him that he felt the pain of their suffering. Well, it takes great courage and kindness to be with the sick and the dying and the poor in their weakness, especially when we are powerless to fix it. But we know that our God is a God who suffers with us and calls us to gratitude and compassion in the midst of pain. It seems like Cinderella's mom was right about needing courage and kindness to get through the trials of life with each other. That kind of kindness and service to others only works when we authentically feel the love for each other. We can't fake it, which is why we need to abide in God, to soak in God's love for us so that it might help us to see and receive one another with those same loving eyes. The late John Lewis, a public servant, a civil rights leader, and a longtime representative in the House, talked about seeing the humanity in everyone, even those who were attacking, beating, or spitting on him. He said, there comes a time when you have to be prepared to literally put your physical body in the way, to go against something that is evil, unjust, and you prepare to suffer the consequences. But whatever you do, he said, whatever your response is, must be done with love, kindness, and that sense of faith. And we know that John Lewis was one to abide with God. Some years back, neurologist Oliver Sacks wrote a fascinating vignette of an intriguing neurological difficulty. You may be familiar with Tourette's syndrome, a mental disorder that causes victims to have any number of physical and verbal tics. Some Tourettic people may have constant facial twitches, while others can suffer from uncontrollable verbal spasms. This goes on constantly and nonstop for people with Tourette's. Well, one man with Tourette's was given to deep lunging bows toward the ground, a few verbal shouts, and also an obsessive-compulsive adjusting and readjusting of his glasses. It turns out this man was a skilled surgeon. Somehow, and for unexplainable reasons, when he puts on his mask and gown to enter the operating room, all of his tics disappear for the duration of the surgery. He loses himself in that role, completely focused on the job at hand. When the surgery is finished, he returns to his odd quirks of glasses adjustment, shouts, and bows. There really can be a great transformation of our lives when we are focused on just one thing, focused to the point that the bad traits disappear, even as the performing of normal tasks becomes all the more meaningful and remarkable. Losing yourself in love. Vincent van Gogh once wrote to his brother, "Whosoever loves much, performs much, and can accomplish much. And what is done in love is well done." So, dear friends, let's pick up our towel each and every day, and with courage and kindness, ask God to show us who to love today.